So in this tutorial we'll be looking at how to create a zip effect, and the things that we'll be covering are how to create the zip and a bit of a rig on how to control it, and the second part of the tutorial will be covering how to create that stitching texture and that white stitching line that runs along the side of the zip. So the first thing I'd like to do is actually explain a few of the disadvantages of using this method, and really the main disadvantage is that you can't really do curved zips, and that's to do with the way the material is attached to the main part of the zip, and if it gets curved it kind of causes rendering artifacts and a few problems. And so this tutorial will be focusing on straight zips. I haven't seen any other tutorials on zips, so I hope this will still be useful. So the first thing I'm going to do is build the actual row of teeth, and the teeth are what link together and create the main kind of mechanism of the zip. And so here I've got a starting object which is little more than an extruded cube, and so I've just extruded it, scaled it in a bit and created a very basic shape. And I haven't applied a subsurf, and that's because we're going to be applying an array to it. And an important thing to note is I've cleared the location rotation and I've made sure the scale has been applied, and you do that with Control A and you just clear the rotation and the scale and then location, and I've also put the cursor in the center as well. So the first thing we're going to do is add a modifier and an array, and immediately we can see it's going in the wrong direction because it should be going on the y-axis, so I'll set the x to 0 and the y to 1. Actually we'll just increase it a bit, and so that we know the exact distance they should be apart, we're going to duplicate the object and move it on the y-axis, remove the modifier on this object, and then do sx minus 1 just to flip it, and then we'll move it into position, and this just serves as a template so that if I drag this number down holding shift to fine tune it, I know the exact distance they should be apart. And so that should do it. So we can delete that one for the minute, and then we'll just increase the count on this to maybe 20, and you can see we've kind of got one half of a zip. And the next thing we're going to do, instead of creating the other half, which we'll do in a minute, we're going to create what I call the profile curve, and that is kind of the shape that the zip makes when it opens. So mine, I had an arc coming out to the side, and that would be the way that the zip curved away as it was opening. So to do that, Shift A, curve Bezier, and then in edit mode I'm just going to bring these points around, straighten it up partially, select all the points SX 0, and then because they're slightly off center now, I'll then do Shift S and selection to cursor. Now it's actually put both of the curve points on top of each other, so I'll just move one of them down, and then we're going to be creating that arcing shape. So I'm just going to bring the point out and then R and 90 and maybe bring it out a bit more, and then bring this handle back in to create that arcing shape. And then one last thing, I will extrude this point up with E and then Y just to create the edge of the curve. And then I'll also, on the object properties, enable X-ray just so we can see it a bit better. And now that we've made it, we can apply it to the teeth. So I'll minimize the array and add a curve. We've only got one curve and it's called Bezier curve. You can see that it's gone off an angle. Because we had the rotations cleared, I know it's going to be on the y-axis, and you can see it's now deforming to the curve. But it's not quite right at the minute because it seems to have rotated at a 90-degree angle, and we can fix this by using a property of the curve called tilt. And if I press T and bring up the toolbar, you can see in edit mode it says tilt, and the shortcut is Control T. So I'm going to hide the toolbar again, and selecting all our points I'll press Control T, and you can see they're starting to rotate. And to make it exact, I'm going to press 9 and 0 on the keypad and enter, and we now have them deforming the correct way. And all that we have to do is put the number up, and you can see we've got it deforming properly. And it's at this point we can duplicate both the object and the curve, so selecting both of them, Shift D, SX -1. And then we just need to move them both down. And then across very slightly. And we know they're going to fit because we made that template object. And now we actually have a partially working zip. But you may not realise it yet. But if you select both of the curves we've just made, and then G and then Y, you can see that by moving the curves and not the objects, we actually have the effect of a zip opening. And if you just look around here while I move down here, you can see that as I move the zip further down, the other end of the zip object kind of starts to deform. And that's because it's being deformed by the curve, but it hasn't actually got any curve points near it. And all that we actually have to do, making sure both our curves are selected, and only our curves, we're going to move them down to the lowest point on the zip, so that's when the zip is fully closed, which is about here. And then in edit mode on one of the curves, I'll just move this point back up to the furthest end of the zip. And you can see it moved in slightly, and that's because it's being deformed accurately. And to get it perfect on the other side, we can actually just link the data of the curves. So although they're separate objects in different positions, they can share the same data. And so if we look on the object data panel, we can see this one uses the data Bezier curve, and this doesn't. But if we change it to Bezier curve, we can see it's now the same length, and they're now linked by that little 2. Which means if we change one, the other will change as well. Now that we've got a working zip, it's a good time to bring in the actual zip object. And I'm not actually going to show you the making of this because it was actually a bit more complex than I thought it would be. So I have pre-modelled it. But if we just go into local view, and that was just with a / on the numpad, you can see it says local up here. And going into edit mode, we can see it's quite basic in shape in that it takes 2 parts of the zip. Out the other end comes the combined zip. And it's not really too complex, but it did take a bit of figuring out to get it looking right. So unfortunately I won't be showing you how to make this. So then going into object mode and pressing / again, it's now time to match up where the zip should be. So I'm just going to move it along until it's in roughly the position it should be, as if it was really opening this zip. So it looks like it should be about there. And if we select our curves as well, and move them all at the same time, it gives the impression that it's opening it. But it'd be useful to have something to control all of these objects, so we're going to add an empty. And to do that, I'm going to press Shift S, cursor selected to bring back the 3D cursor, and then Shift A, empty, and then plane axes. Move it above everything. And then selecting our 3 objects that are going to be moving, and then selecting the empty last, we're going to parent them by pressing Ctrl P, and then Object and Keep Transform, and that just means the objects will stay in the position, but they will be parented. And if we move it now, we can see we've got a working rig. So the next step is to add the actual cloth or material that's going to be opening with the zip and what the zip is going to be attached to. And to do that, we're going to go into the array, and actually I'm going to tab out and go into local view with /, then zooming in, selecting everything, Shift S, cursor selected, and then Shift A, add plane. Now because of the way we set our array up using a relative distance, you can see that as you scale the plane up, it's actually affecting the other objects in the array. But you can see that the midpoint between these 2 objects is the red line, and so that's where we're going to size up the plane to. And then all we have to do is reduce the array to 1. And I know that'll work because of the way we used uniform scale or applied scale on the object to begin with. And then I've just ticked merge so that the vertices merge together. So we can then move the plane back to about there. And then we can move these vertices back as well. And then / to bring back all the other objects. I am then going to, the same way that we linked the two curves data together, we're going to do the same with the zips. So I can see that this zip is using the data of cube 002, and so I'll change this to use the same one. And all we have to change is the array property back to 1, and we've got matching objects. But at the minute we're unable to get the cloth to go very far, and what I mean by that is that if I go into edit mode and make it so the modifiers also appear in edit mode, and still with this edge selected, if I move it on the x-axis, you can start to see that they overlap, and when you render this will start to give artifacts, and you can already see it in the 3D view that you can, because they're overlapping, it doesn't know which face to display. So we'll just move them back in a bit. Now the way to fix it, and it's the same reason why we can't do curved zips because of the artifacts that appear, but the one way to get around it is to make this curve far bigger and less of a severe curve. And by severe I just mean it's quite a short distance that it's curving over, but what we can do is make it a lot bigger by bringing it down and out, and then bringing this handle in, and it just means it's curving over a greater distance, and it also means that you can bring out the material further. And because they curves are linked, we're editing them both at the same time, so we don't have to worry about updating that one. But going back into edit mode, and even though it's curved, we're still pressing G and X, because if we turn off the curve, that's actually the real position they're in. So pressing G and X, we can then bring this material out far further. You've just got to be careful where they start to overlap. So it looks like we can get to about here. So the material's quite far out, and then you see the other ones updated. And all I'm going to do now is update the array to use 140, so it's a bit longer because we made that curve bigger. And I'm also going to change the resolution of this curve. Because currently it's quite low, so if I put it to 20 and you just watch the outline of the zip, it'll get a lot smoother. And that's because we're giving more subdivisions to the curve. And that really is all there is to it. It's all to do with just moving these original curves. And you can see it's got a bit slower, and I expect that's because we've not only extended the array, but we've also created a far higher resolution curve for it to deform with. And so you could just keyframe this empty to open and close a zip. You can duplicate this whole thing by selecting it and duplicating it, and have several zips opening like I did in my video. The next section in this tutorial is actually going to be focusing on the materials and how to create several stitching effects using multiple UV maps. So if you only wanted to see how the zip works, that is the end of how it works. You don't need to continue watching, but if you'd like to know how to get the materials to look like I had them, then please carry on watching. So the first thing we're going to do is add a material which is going to be a fake chrome, and we're going to add it to the parts of the zip we want to be shiny. So I'll add a new material, and it's added it to everything. I'll click the plus and then new for another one, and I will lighten this up and darken this one down just so we can have a bit of difference. And in edit mode, I'm just going to select one point of the actual material and press L, and it will select everything that's connected to it. I'll then invert the selection and assign the teeth the lighter material so we can see them easy. And we're going to name this Chrome. And if I tab out, it's updated the other one. And what we're going to do to this is add a new texture. It's going to be an image, and then I will open an HDR image, and I'm using a slightly blurred one so we can fake a blurry reflection very easily. And then I'm just going to set it to be mapped to the reflection, and that basically means that the surface of the material is actually going to act like a reflection, and it's going to map that texture I opened onto it. And to show you that, just enable this other layer where I've got a camera and a light. All this light is pretty much a standard point light, and it's just got a ray shadow with 4 soft samples on it. And then on the world settings, I'll enable environment lighting at 0.5, and we're on ray traced as well. And if I just save and then render, we'll see what it looks like. And one thing I forgot to do is just apply that chrome to our main part of the zip as well. So I'll just choose chrome and re-render that. We're getting a nice reflection, but it's faked, and it's very quick because it's faked. And the next part will be moving on to the actual cloth and how that should look. So back to the material, we're going to reduce the specularity to almost be nothing, and then reduce the hardness to about 5, because obviously cloth doesn't have a very sharp specularity value. And we'll then move on to the texturing. Now, the first thing I'm going to do is actually add in a couple of loop cuts, and that is because later on when we do the stitching, we are going to be using multiple UV maps, and it's going to be easy to do if we can isolate the faces that we want to have specific stitching. And you'll understand this a bit more later, but for the minute I'm just putting 2 loop cuts in so that later we can map textures just onto these faces within the loops. The next thing I'm going to do is select everything, and then with B and the middle mouse button I'm going to deselect the objects I don't want selected, and I'm then going to press Shift E and escape, and I'm going to move this onto the layer below layer 1, so I'm going to press Alt 1 and I'll move it there. And that's just because we're going to be applying the arrays, and it's always good to have a backup of the object without your modifiers applied, so if something goes wrong we can change it. So the important part at this point is that you want to make sure that you've got your arrays set up the way you want, because like I said, we're going to be applying them, and that's so we can do some UV unwrapping and the texturing. But the first thing we need to do is make them individual users, because you can't currently apply a modifier when it's got linked data, and that means these are both sharing the same vertices, and so we can't apply a modifier. An easy fix is just to click the 2 and it makes them both individual. We can then apply the array and then do the same on this one, apply the array, and we can then link them back up, so it's using cube 006, and we'll set this to use 006. And the reason why we're doing this is that so they can share the UV maps, and they will then share the textures as well. So now that we've got them applied, we can select everything, and even though it's being deformed by the curve, it won't show up in the UV editor, so we'll just do U and then project from view. And if I just drag out a new view and change it to the UV image editor and then clear out the render, we can see our UVs are undeformed. And what I'm going to do is just open up an image that I've already prepared, and all it is a purple circle in an orange square, and this is going to act as a repeating pattern for our material. So I'm just going to change the textured mode and then just scale up our UVs, and I'll go into camera mode so we can see exactly what's going to be rendered. And what I like to do is just move one of the circles into the center, and you can see as I tabbed out of edit mode, it updated the texture because they are now sharing the UVs, and we are then going to use this as our first UV map. So what I'm going to do is name this as pattern, and then over in the textures we'll do a new texture. It's going to be image. We don't need to load it again, we can load it from the menu. We choose UV, and we make sure we're using the one we've just named, because we are going to have multiple ones. And that's all we need to do for that one. And I will name this as pattern color. We are going to have quite a few, so it's quite important to name them so we don't get too confused. And the next thing we're going to do is add the actual stitching bump map. And to do that we're going to use a new UV map. So I'm going to call this stitching bump. Tab into edit mode, remove this image, and we'll load another one I have prepared. And this is going to be the bump map for the stitching, and again it's a tileable texture that I've created in Photoshop. And what you'll be able to see is when I scale it out, it gives the impression of stitching. So I'm just going to scale it to roughly the size we want. And I should say that if you haven't used multiple UV maps before, I do have a separate tutorial on this, so if you're unsure of what I'm doing, or if I'm not really explaining it enough in this tutorial, please jump over and watch that one. What it basically means is that I can edit this one, and it can have separate scaling to this one, and I can actually switch between them, and different textures can use the different scaling values. And it's not really a scaling value, they can just use completely separate UVs. So if I tab out of edit mode, this one's also updated, and I can then use that UV map in a new texture. And this will be stitching bump. It'll be an image, and again we don't need to load it, it's already here. But this time, under UV, we'll make sure we choose stitching bump, and instead of colour, it's going to be the normal. We're going to use RGB to intensity to make sure it's using the correct values, and we're going to choose the best quality. And so if I just save and then render, you can see we're getting the bump effect on top of the pattern because they're using separate UV maps. But we can't really see it properly, so we are also going to add a new texture called stitching colour. So we're going to add an image, and we're going to choose the same image as last time, and so we'd use the same UV map, which was stitching bump, but I'm going to set the colour to be 0.85 because we can allow some of the orange to show through from underneath, and I'm also going to set it to multiply so it simply darkens the image. And to reduce the effect of this a bit, because everything that's black and grey here will darken the image, and so if I put the contrast up to 1.7, it's now far whiter, so there's less grey, and so the image will get a bit less darker. We'll then save again. It's always safe to save before rendering, and then we'll give it a render. And so you can see now that that colour is really giving it a better effect, but you can also see that the colour is still showing through because we set it to 0.85 and to multiply. So the next thing to do is get that stitching line, that white line of stitches going along the zip, and it's why we put those two loop cuts in. And to do that, we're going to use our third and final UV map called stitching line. So we'll go into edit mode, remove this image, and open another one I've prepared, and it's a PNG, so it's got a solid white stitch and then a clear background. We won't be able to preview this properly in the 3D view, but we can see it here. And I'm actually going to come out of the camera view and then do U and reset. So I'm resetting the UVs, and then in face select mode I'm just going to select these, and that's that row of faces we created, and then U projection view, and I'm going to scale this up so that it's the width of the image, and then just center it so we know exactly where our stitch is going to appear. And then I'll invert the selection, so I'm selecting everything else, and I'm going to scale that down, and so it's part of the black or the transparent, so no stitching will show on that part. And if I tab into object mode, we'll then add the new texture called stitching line color, and this will be an image, be the image we just chose, be UV, and the stitching line UV map, and it will be color. So then, just to see how it's going, we'll render again, and you can see our stitching line has now appeared. And it may be a bit big, but you can fine tune it if you want to. And the next thing to do is, and I'll just expand this out so we can see the names better, we're going to add another texture, and it's going to be the bump map for this white stitching. So stitching line bump, And again, an image. We'll open a new one this time, and it's basically similar to the previous image, except it's now got a solid black background, and it kind of has a gradient that fades in towards the center of the stitch, which will hopefully raise it up. And again, this will be UV stitching line. It won't be the color, it'll be the normal RGB into intensity, so it takes into account the black values. Set it to best quality. I don't know why we'd set it to anything other than best quality. And then that will have bumped it. And so if I render it, you might not be able to see it at this resolution. You just have to trust me, it has bumped it. But we do actually have one problem, and I don't know if we can actually see it at this resolution, so what I'll do, I'll render it at a bit higher resolution, just one section of it. And what we can see is we had a bump map set for this main part of the stitching, but it doesn't know that it's not supposed to bump this white stitching, so we're getting these grey lines that are intersecting the stitch, and that's the bump map from underneath, or that's meant to be underneath, that's showing through. And so what we have to do is try and tell Blender not to bump the white stitching. And to do that, we kind of have to erase part of this main bump map. So what I'll do, I'll move it all the way to the bottom with the down arrows, and I'll put a new texture above it. And what this texture is going to do is act as a mask for the bump map, and it will hopefully remove these parts from the bump map so it will no longer bump it. So new image, open, and this one's slightly different, and it's just black and white. It's got a solid black background and a solid white stitch, so it's acting as a mask. It's going to have the same UV map as the other stitching lines. It's not going to affect the colour. This time it's going to be a stencil, and we're also going to put it to negative because, well, you can see if you render it right now it would mask the incorrect part, so we're just going to invert it, and we're also going to put it to RGB into intensity so it takes into account the black and white values properly. And what that's doing is if you set a texture to stencil, it basically tells Blender to affect the texture below it, which is this one. So it's masking this one out. And if we render this again, saving again, just for safety, we should see we're no longer seeing that grey line which was intersecting it. And that's because we subtracted this white stitch away from this original bump map. Now, I'd also like to explain why we used the multiple UV maps, and that's very simply because it would be very difficult, or maybe not difficult, just time consuming to create this by hand, especially if you've got this pattern on top of it. In fact, I'll just render it. Like I was saying, it would be very time consuming to make this all as one big image, and the way we've done it, we've just used very small images that are tileable. And if at some point I think, well, actually this stitching is far too big, I can then just scale up the UVs, or scale down, whichever one it is, and they will get smaller, and I don't have to worry about either the colour or the white stitching, and I don't have to redo all that to adjust for the size. And it just allows very small images to be used, and it was really quite quick to set that up, and it's going to be quite quick if you want to change it as well. And so that is the final effect, and you can see we're getting a bit of pinching here, but really to my eye it's kind of looking like the material is almost bulging, like it really would if you were pulling two bits of material apart, and it's not really looking like it's a texture problem, and it especially won't look like that if you're opening the zip at some speed. And so that is the end of the tutorial. All you need to do now is, in the same way that we duplicated it to move it to another layer, we can select it, B, and then middle mouse button to deselect what we don't want. And you can then duplicate this whole rig, and I'll press Z. You can then rotate it around. And the only thing you have to remember is that this has to move along the y-axis. And now you may think, well, we've just rotated it so it's not facing the y-axis, but this still has a local rotation. And if we were to turn on this little 3D widget here and set it to local, you can see it's still pointing in that direction we need, and we could just drag it along there. But a way I like to do it is without using that widget, because I find it gets in the way. I can just press G and then Y, and then tap Y a second time, and it goes into local view. And you can see at the bottom it says local, and it's a very quick way to do that. And so you can see you can have multiple zips opening, like I did, and all you have to do is animate this empty. So, I hope you've enjoyed this tutorial. I hope at some point to be able to update it and able to show a curved zip being attached to material as well, and maybe that will need some kind of cloth simulation. But for the minute, we're just doing straight zips, and I hope you found some of it useful. If you think I can do something better, please say so in the comments, and if you have any other suggestions for tutorials you might like, please also suggest them. And I hope to see you in the next tutorial. Goodbye.